Hey, welcome to the channel where we show you how to put some prep in your step. Today we're going to be looking at a ternary plot and creating the template for that. So this past week, Kevin Wee released a viz as part of the Back to Viz Basics challenge and decided to use the ternary plot and also add some reference lines to it so that way every point inside the plot had the lines kind of outlining where they lie on each of the sides of the triangle. And so we're going to take a look at the viz, kind of try to understand some of the data prep that went into it, and then build out the prep flow. So let's jump into it. So if you haven't seen the viz yet, this is what it looks like. Really effectively done. And really that ternary plot is the main focus of this viz. And since they can be a little bit difficult to read and understand, that's the only chart that you have to focus on here. So I think that was really effective. And then also that border that's used to sort of highlight the lines and everything, just a really great use of this chart type. And, you know, when a lot of people saw it and they were kind of just wondering what went into this, what was the data prep look like? And so Kevin and I synced up and he sent me a copy of his data set and helped me understand why the data was structured this way. And so yeah, we just wanted to release this prep flow to make it to where if this is something that you wanted to build out and you've got a good use case for it, that data prep side is a lot easier. So now that you've seen the viz, let's take a look at the original data. So this is what the original data set looked like. Again, this is part of the Back to Viz Basics challenge. And so you just had 3 columns to work with, country, metric, and percent. And so we've got this metric should not, and then a no answer plus and minus. And then in the data set that as Kevin worked through it, he prepared a couple of different sheets here. The first sheet is this triangle coordinate sheet. And this isn't what's used in the workbook, but it is used, at least when I looked at this, it helped me understand what was actually happening in this plot. So you see these vertexes. There's 100 points here for each side. So if the metric should, there's 100 points. The metric should not, there's 100 points. And then the metric no answer, there's 100 points. And so the reason for that is when we look at the original chart again, each of these metrics are a percent from 0 to 100. And so if you look at this, this would be taking a look at the percent. So South Korea falls here. 44% of South Korea was should, 53% was should not, and the rest was no answer. And so it's a percent of total. And so that's why when Kevin was mapping it out, there's these 100 points. And so if we look here, we can see that there's a column for each of our metrics and then an X and Y point. And so in this first column, should goes from 1% to I believe 100%. Should not goes the opposite. It goes from 99% down to 0. And then no answer just remains constant at 0. And our X and Y plots are using these calculations. So for X, it's this 0.5 times your second column plus your third column. And then that's divided by these 3 together, which if you think about it, it's really just divided by 100 because all of these together add up to 100 or 100%, but 1. And so this Y calculation also, this negative 1/2 times the square root of 3 times our third metric divided by 1. That's going to give us our Y coordinate. And so as we go down though, when you go to this next vertex, you can see that the sort of order of the columns changes. Now the first column is all zeros. The second one goes from 0.1 to 1. And then the third one goes from 0.99 down to 0. And because of that, we're still using the same formula to get the X and Y coordinates, but we're getting different results now. And then for the last side, again, the order changes. So really, again, this is just an outline of how our data set is going to work. Each side is going to have one measure that results in 0. And then the other 2 that are sort of the result of, they add up to 100, but just depends on how the data is structured. And so what Kevin did here is there's this ternary plot sheet. And so really the main thing to focus on is there's these A, B, and C metrics. And so first you've got what your metric is here, what your metric is here, but then the no answer piece becomes what's left over to get to 100%. Again, the X and Y calculations are still that 0.5 and that -1/2 times square root. And the reason why it's a -1/2 is because Kevin wanted that ternary plot to be an upside down triangle. So what we've done in the prep flow is we've done it both ways to where you can do an upside down or right side up. But here, each of those coordinates for each line, and what I mean by each line is each of these reference lines here. So there's 3 reference lines that connect to each point. And so that's what these A, B, and C columns represent. This gives us the coordinates for one reference line, this gives us the coordinates for another reference line, and this gives us the coordinates for another reference line. So that way, all of those reference lines can be then tied back to that central point. So each of these falls on one side of the triangle, and then let's make them meet up back to this central point. And so this is what we end up with. We end up with something that looks similar to our triangle coordinate, in that we have each side sort of pivoted out into, so all 3 columns are going to be pivoted out into one long table, but we also have those added columns. So now we have our central point and our line. And then we've also got this column here sort of identifying, here's the first line, here's the second line, and here's the third line. And so that's what we're going to recreate in our prep flow. So let's get prep opened up. And I'm going to use Superstore sample data set because it's just my favorite one to work with. It's just got a good example data structure that you can transfer in a lot of ways. And so the way that we're going to build this prep flow out, it is going to require, even though I'm going to hand over the pre-built files, it's still going to require a little bit of work on your end. And so I'm going to talk that through. Really the main reason being we're going to use the pivot step, and we're going to pivot rows to columns. Now when you do this, if you get any errors in that pivot step, you have to essentially delete the step and rebuild it. And so I can't really give you a pre-built prep flow that because you have to tie your data to it, and you've got to choose your metrics and your columns. And so it would just give a bunch of errors if we tried to do that. And so in the pre-built version, you've got the initial steps, and then you've got your right side up or upside down steps. And so I'll show again how to build each of these segments and why we've done it that way. So let's start with orders. All right. And so we know what the orders field looks like. And what we want to do is we want to identify what our dimension is, what our metric is, and then what each side of our triangle is going to be. And so ideally you've got something that you can identify that has 3 fields in it. You can also do some filtering if you're really only trying to look, maybe your column has more than those 3 values, but you can exclude what you need. So to make it simple on us, we're going to use segment. Segment has 3 values, and so this is going to be sort of each side of our triangle. And we're also going to break that down by state. So in our ternary plot, each state is going to be plotted basically against where it's weighted on each of those segments. So I just need that segment. And again, we're going to break it down by state. And then for my metric, we're going to use sales. And so I only need those 3 fields. I'm going to say keep only. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to rename this to dimension. And I'm going to rename this to metric. And so we've got that done. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to aggregate these, right? Because what I really want to do is I need to get to a % of total. And so for example, I need to show how much consumer sales represent in Alabama, what was the % of sales for corporate for Alabama. So each state is going to add up to 100% across these 3 segments. And so to do that, I need to get the percent of total. So I'm going to add an aggregate, group by my dimension in my segment, and aggregate up my metric. And so now that I've done that, I'm going to, let's just call this aggregate. And so now I'm going to calculate my percent of total. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a field that is the total. Let's call this total dimension metric. We're going to use an LOD. And so fixed at each dimension, what is the sum of the metric? Because again, we want the percent of total for each state here, but each dimension. So there's my total, right? And so if I click Alabama, the total is replicated across each row. And so now I'm able to calculate what this metric represents as a percent to the whole. And so to do that, I'm going to create a calculated field. I'm going to call it percent. And then I'm going to round this to 2 decimal places. So I'm going to say round metric divided by total dimension metric. And that's not what I wanted to do. I forgot to add my decimal places. 2, round to 2 decimal places. There we go. So that is now my percent of total, and I can get of these 2 fields. So now this is starting to look like our original data set, to where we had the 3 columns. If I look at the original data set here, we've got 3 columns here. And so now I've got those 3 columns. And if I look at Alabama, these add up to 100%. Now, because there might be a little bit of rounding error here, like we might get it adding up to 99% instead of 100, I'm gonna fix that here in a later step, because I'm just going to work off the assumption that if these 2, whatever these 2 add up, then the third should be the remainder to get to 100%. And again, I'm just doing that to account for some rounding errors. So I'm going to call this percent of dimension. And so now I'm going to add a pivot step. So for the pivot step, what we're going to do is we are going to pivot each segment into its own column. And so I'm going to change this to rows to columns, drag segment here, and percent down here. And so now each of those becomes its own column, which is exactly what I want. So now what I'll do here is add a clean step and rename my fields. This one becomes segment 1. This one becomes segment 2. This one becomes segment 3. All right. So now that I've got those renamed, I'm going to go in here and do a couple more things. So first I'm going to replace any null values with zeros. So I'm going to say segment 1 is going to become ZN segment 1. Segment 2 is going to become ZN segment 2. And segment 3 is going to become ZN segment 3. All right, now I can basically replace my segment 3 field, because what I really want it to be is 1 minus the total, or the sum of segment 1 plus segment 2. And I want to do this because I really want each row to add up to 100%, and this will just prevent any rounding errors from affecting that. Now I can create my X and Y calculations. So for Y, we're going to do 0.5, multiply that by parentheses 2 times segment 2 plus segment 3. And then we're going to divide this by segment 1 plus segment 2 plus segment 3. And now for the reasoning for this, the explanation for why we're doing this calculation and how this comes together inside of Tableau is actually explained really well by Andy Griebel. He's got a video about how to create this plot, and so I definitely recommend checking that out to really just further understand what's happening in the calculations for this ternary plot. And so I'm going to link to that below, but let's keep moving through this. So here's our calculation for Y, And then I'm going to create a calculated field for x, which is going to be -1/2. Again, we're using negative because we want the ternary plot in this case to be upside down. And we're going to say square root of 3. And then we're going to multiply this by segment 3. And then we're going to divide that whole thing by the sum of segments 1, 2, and 3. Perfect. So there's our y and there's our x. And right now, again, we're building the upside down triangle. And so we can do this 2 ways. And so I'll start from here, actually, I can pivot. So we'll start building out the upside down plot, and then we'll do a copy paste for the right side up part. But those are our x and y calculations. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to create, if we look back at our original sheet, there's these 3 fields. The A underscore, which again, so this is the plot, the points for our point inside of the ternary plot. Now we're going to create the points that tie back to each side of the triangle. And so what we did here, or not here, what we did here was this is the point that goes inside of the plot. Now we're going to create the points that tie back to each side of that triangle. So I'm going to add a clean step here. I'm going to call this line 1. And I'm going to create a calculated field. I'm going to call this line index because that's what it's called in our template workbook. And this is going to be 1. And then what I'm going to do here is create the fields for my sides. So A segment 1, sorry. Segment 1. And this is going to be just a copy of segment 1. Because if we look in our sheet, again, let me go to the unpivoted version. So in the first line, A underscore, right? This is just a copy of our original value. Okay, and so that's what I did here. And then if I look at the next value here, this is 1 minus this value. And so again, each line is still going to add up to 100%, but we need a value of 0 as well. And so each line is going to switch where that 0 is placed. And so in this one, it's the third metric. So segment 1, and we're going to create a segment 2. And this one's going to be 1 minus a segment 1. And then we're going to create a segment 3. And this is going to be 0. And then we're going to create the point. So AX is going to be, and if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that when originally my Y calculation had 0.5. Now my X calculation has 0.5. So when you're actually calculating the plot for each of these reference lines, that switches around. And so we're going to do 0.5, but the formula is still similar, right? So 0.5 times 2 times a segment 2 plus a segment 3. And then we're going to divide that by a segment 1 plus a segment 2 plus a segment 3. All right. Save that. And then now I'm going to create my calculated field for AY, which is going to be -1 divided by 2 times the square root of 3 times a segment 3. And that is going to be divided by a segment 1. Oops, let me put this in parentheses. A segment 2 plus a segment 3. All right. So these are the fields for my first side, the point on my first side. And so now what I can do is I can copy this to make my next couple of points. I'm going to copy, paste it here. So now I'm going to go in here, name this line 2. And now my calculations are just going to change just a little bit. So Here, I'm going to do a segment 1, instead of being a copy of segment 1, is going to become 0. A segment 2 is going to be a copy of segment 2. And a segment 3 is going to be 1 minus a segment 2. And then my X and Y stays the same, but my line index is also going to change to 2. And so the reason why I switched that around, again, if we look at our original points, here there was 0, then a copy of the second metric, and then getting that metric to add up to a total of 100. And so now that we've done that, that one was a lot easier. So we're going to do that one more time. Copy and paste here. Call this line 3. And then in this case, a segment 2, or we're going to change this line index first. So let's change this to 3. We have to do a segment 2 first. So we're going to move a segment 2 up. We're going to make this 0. We're going to make a segment 3 next. A segment 3 is going to be a copy of segment 3. And then a segment 1 is going to be 1 minus a segment 3. Then everything else stays the same. And so now we've got here, we calculated the point, the coordinate for the point inside of the plot. And then here we calculated the coordinates for each point on each side of the triangle. So now we can union these together. Oops, let me add that to my union. We can remove the table names field because we don't need it. And this should get us our table. And so if I come here and click output, I'm just going to call this Ternary-YT, and I'm going to run that flow. Awesome. So now we've got our data set, and this is again for the upside down piece. So open up my workbook, and you'll notice that Kevin added this template page to his workbook for us. So if we go here to the sheet, a couple of the names have changed. And so this is going to allow us to easily plug in our data. So I'm going to take that output. I'm going to add a new data source here. Find my output, that Ternary-YT. And so switching these data sources, if you've been following along with the series, you'll notice that sometimes I kind of change things around to make sure that there's a smooth swap. So if I look here, I see that line index X and Y are all up here in dimensions. And so I want to make sure that my new data source matches that structure. So I'm going to take these 3 fields, drag them up to dimensions. So that should make it a smoother swap. And so now I'm going to go in here, place the data source, place it to my new extract. Probably going to get, yeah, there we go. So this country label field is really just a, there we go. It's just using the dimension field here. So there we go. So that was a nice easy swap. And now we can see there's those state names in there. If you're using this, you could clean up the labels there. Obviously, if you wanted to, you could go through your prep flow and use the actual field names instead of segments. You'd have to replace a couple of calculations in there, but it would be a little bit easier to work with instead of having to create custom labels for these. But there you go. There's your upside down ternary plot. And if you wanted to do it right side up, that's actually pretty simple to do as well. So you can see here, I've got this workbook here. So this is what the right side up would look like. So we've got the upside down, the right side up. So for the right side up, all we're going to do is just take this flow here, copy that, paste these steps down here, and just change the X calculation here, remove that negative symbol, And then in our lines, we're going to go into each of our lines and remove the negative symbol from the Y calculation. All right, let me make sure. Got that one removed. Got that one good. That one good. Come in here. Change this to, now just add a 2 to it. That way it's a different output. Run that flow. And so I'm going to open up a new workbook. And we'll be able to plug this one in and get our right side up plot. And so here's my workbook now. Go to my plot, new data source, more. All right, come back to the page. Again, take my Y, X, and my line index and drag them up to dimensions. And then replace the data source. And just click out of that little zoom that was there, and there you go. There's your right side up. So now you've got the flow to work for your upside down plot, your right side up plot, and you can apply this in a couple of different ways. And I mean, again, you know, Kevin did some great work here in figuring out how to get this math to work, to add those reference lines. And, you know, really the prep flows here are just to enable more people to be able to use a visualization like this if they've got the use case for it, without having to go through a bunch of extra work just getting that data prepared. You know, like I said, you'll have to do a couple of, you know, identifying your fields and maybe some renaming, but for the most part, all of the math is in there, the structure is in there, it's going to get you where you need to be. So, you know, these prep templates, this is exactly what I was hoping for. As people start creating these really amazing visualizations that do require this work, that we can collaborate and create something like this, a resource for the community that you can use to achieve the same results. So yeah, you know, if you've got any trouble with it, let me know. I'll be happy to help out. If you've got any feedback or any visualizations that you're looking for to get a prep template for, let me know. And yeah, I hope that you get some use out of this, and I hope to see you in the next one.